Chris Rogers is Associate Professor of Linguistics at BYU. He focuses his research on language documentation, description, and typology, with primary interest in the indigenous languages of Central and South America. He is a man of many ideas, and his current interests range from classroom gamification to information packaging, precategoriality, semantic alignment, and linguistic diversity in language ecosystems, which will be the topic of his remarks today. More broadly, Professor Rogers' primary interest is really in how languages evolve over time. He is one of a number of linguists around the world that works actively to try to document and preserve languages that are rapidly disappearing from their language communities. He is actually the last speaker of the Xincan language group in Guatemala. There are 4 Xincan languages. He is all the people that have taught him those languages have passed on. So we're grateful for him to be able to share a little bit about that today. At a personal level, he is a very avid backpacker, likes spending lots of time outside, and a swing dancer, which is another way of preserving and potentially transforming culture. So we are really delighted to welcome Chris Rogers here to be with us today. He will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, at which point we will open it up to a Q&A session, and we will go until 1 p.m. today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Rogers.
Thank you for being here today. I'm really honored to be participating in today's discussion about preserving and transforming cultures. As you just heard, my primary research interests are in the documentation, description, and inferential analyses and typology of the world's languages. And I focus a lot on the languages and language communities in Central and South America, though I have done some work with communities in both Africa and India. The goal of this work, for those of you who are not familiar with this kind of research, is to create resources that can be used to preserve linguistic heritages and to systematically study the language systems that users create and continue to transform over generations of use and practice. And before I start my remarks today, I would like to make some brief acknowledgments here. I feel like I understand linguistic diversity and how to study languages scientifically, but I also recognize and acknowledge my dependence on a lot of people, some of them who are represented in this collage of pictures here. Primarily, I'd like to thank the many, many speakers of Xincan, Wichi, Tol, Macu, Iñapari, Huauterero, Xiuyar, Quichua, Quiché, Aymara, Quechua, Mixteco, Spanish, English, Chiluba, and Telugu for teaching me their languages and why they are so valuable to their specific communities and to our global community. Each one of these people has a name and a unique story that I value and respect. And though some of our cultural practices are different, we have found a way to be connected, and I, at least because of that connection, have been transformed into a better person, and I hope they can say the same thing. I might add as a personal acknowledgement also here that I'm wearing a traditional Waurani necklace that represents family, unity, and friendship, which I find is an apt summary of my experience in doing language documentation and description. My remarks today are based on research that I am currently doing for a book project that's focusing on the value of linguistic diversity from a globally and a local perspective, local to the communities where languages are used. The goals of this research are listed here to argue that linguistic diversity is essential to individual health and community sustainability, to argue that language information, language data, and language evidence are not the same thing, and to argue that linguists are, I guess, to support the claim that linguists are not polyglots or not necessarily polyglots. We're more like inferential linguistic technologists or something like that. And then that there is a consistent need to use linguistic tools to document, describe, and explore all of the languages of the world, but that there are some languages and language communities that are in more dire need than others. Unfortunately, I won't have time to talk about all four of these things, and so I've chosen to summarize these points in my discussion today in talking about how we can define linguistic diversity and how changes to it affect the authoritative and authentic use of a language. So to be able to do this, I have to give you a little background. So for the next couple slides, this might be a little basic for those of you who have taken linguistics or who are colleagues in linguistics. I'm sorry for the basicness, but for the rest of you, this is for you. Okay. The first thing is language families. There are somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 distinct languages spoken all over the world. Some of these languages can be clustered in groups of shared historical descent. We call these language families. Many of the other languages can't be grouped into these language families, and we call these language isolates. Each family or isolate employs remarkably similar ways of grammatically encoding particular communicative tasks. For example, the Germanic languages and the Indo-European languages, to which English belong, show a remarkable similar way of encoding grammatical case, word categories, word order, voice, and laryngeal phonological contrasts, among other things. However, within these language families, there's also a lot of differences, and these differences are the hallmarks for distinguishing one language from another. In fact, the language family similarities that linguists recognize are often only observable through very abstract linguistic comparisons, and for the average speaker, they may not be aware that their languages belong to a historical family or not. Now to the language systems. Each of the speakers of the more than 6,000 languages spoken around the world show remarkable internal variation in the way their languages are used, and this variation is based on many social and cultural predictors, such as sex, gender, age, class, religion, and geography, among some others. These varieties of a language internal to a language are called sociolects. The most well-known type is a dialect. You might have heard of those. The process continues down to the individual, where there's individual variation in the linguistic systems that are used by each person, and these are called idiolects. In some ways, this diagram represents what is meant by linguistic diversity, a quantification of the variations of language, so that we can talk about there being an X number of language families, X number of sociolects, or X number of idiolects. However, the potential variations have a qualitative place in both the language communities and for the identities of the language users. Thus, linguistic diversity must involve more than just counting things, right? This is because every speaker and community of every language exists in a sort of ecosystem of necessary adaptation, and I'll represent that here as in this diagram. A linguistic ecosystem is a metaphor borrowed from other fields like geography and biology and others to indicate that distinct languages and language varieties are essential to the success of every language community. The speakers of these distinct languages do not use their languages in a communicative bubble, but rely on internal and external pressures to form a unique linguistic system and social identity. To make it easier to talk about linguistic ecosystems today, I've avoided the issue of the very first language speaker and have started with an already existing community of parents who have a linguistic system. And I've also couched the terms the ecosystem in terms of family relationships. So this is really about multi-generational transmission, as we'll talk about in a minute. The way this ecosystem works is that parents who have a linguistic system talk to their children, and this allows the children to functionally create a linguistic system. This is called intergenerational transmission. However, during the intergenerational transmission process, there are minute changes that a child may make, and these may be because of learning mistakes, because of pressures towards ease of production, or towards ease of perception. So, for example, I think it's very common for parents to recognize that their children are doing really funny things with the language that they never have heard anybody do before. So, example, 2 of my kids are here, and some of them will say things like thanks, where I have thanks, right? And this is a gradual, minute change that is unique to them and a few other people I've heard. This gradual change is called drift. Moreover, very soon after birth or immediately after birth, intergenerational transmission can be, or always is, interrupted or disrupted by speakers who use a different linguistic system than the ones that the child's parents use. The effect is that features that are not in the child's parents' linguistic system are adopted into the child's growing system. This is called diffusion, and diffusion can happen at the macro and micro levels, where micro diffusion refers to diffusion from other idiolects or sociolects of the same language, and macro diffusion refers to diffusion from other languages or language families. Because humans are social, the child goes through a process of dynamic selection, where they select the forms and functions that they want in their linguistic system. And they often do this subconsciously, though it can be a conscious selection. The result is a system that is different from their parents, but that is influenced by their own linguistic transmission heritage and by the social diffusion around them. However, because language varies not only individually, but collectively in terms of social and cultural groups, this social selection process, this dynamic selection process, is influenced by a degree of quote-unquote acceptability. So that a child must determine if a feature Y for a linguistic system is appropriate for a social group G. This influence can also be covert or overt and comes from things like language attitudes, language use policy and planning measures, or official and or unofficial oversight bodies of governance. Thus, the child's linguistic system is constantly undergoing some form of evaluative feedback, something I call the evaluative feedback loop, to determine the authenticity of the language use by socially authoritative individuals or groups. Importantly, everybody who's going through this dynamic selection process and this evaluative feedback loop belongs to social groups, many different social groups that can be hierarchically nested. So that the evaluative feedback can often create conflicts for the people creating their systems. What might be appropriate for one social group might be inappropriate for another social group. So I see this conflict, at least in some ways in terms of language, as changes in what is considered authoritative and authentic language use. And this is what I'm going to talk about today. Of course, I just want to mention here the dynamic selection process never really actually ends, and it's not really about children. We go through this our whole lives. We're constantly adding and subtracting, changing and adapting our linguistic systems until they fit us just right, until they become a perfect representation of our varied social and personal identities. And then, of course, the rest of the ecosystem that I'm not going to be talking about is that some people will become parents and start the intergenerational transmission process again, and others will be sources of diffusion, both macro and micro diffusion. This is what I see as the meaning of linguistic diversity. Not just that there are X number of languages or X number of language families spoken throughout the world, but that each is a valuable addition to our individual and collective experience. The term linguistic diversity certainly has quantitative scope. You have to have a variety of things. You have to count things in order for there to be diversity. But this is not the entire story, at least when it comes to languages. Language diversity is a representation of an accepted heterogeneity in form and function of the linguistic systems of the world, which entails a sometimes unequal quantitative variety and a qualitative valuation of and appreciation for the differences in languages, histories, cultures, and users of specific language communities. The UN, and under the auspices of UNESCO, have determined this to be the decade of indigenous languages, so that language diversity, linguistic diversity, is at the forefront of a lot of academic and political concerns in the world right now. Linguists from all over the world have commented on the increasing loss of the world's linguistic diversity, and indigenous communities have been highlighted as those that are most at risk for losing access to both quantitative and qualitative linguistic diversity in their ecosystems. In the discipline of linguistics, the concern over linguistic diversity is at the forefront of current thinking, and it goes under terms such as endangered languages, language revitalization, language planning and policy, and language rights. And my research often interfaces with these topics. And I'll just be, if you're interested in learning more about those, you can go to my BYU faculty profile page, and I have a whole bibliography of readings that you should do if you're interested in this kind of stuff. So when we say that there are approximately 6,000 languages in the world, we also want to know the state of their ecosystems and how to strengthen them. And what we can do as outsiders and insiders of these language communities. Just like in biological ecosystems, linguistic ecosystems can be disrupted by natural events and human actions, such as colonization, natural disasters, conflict, uninformed social policies. And this can disrupt the processes of transmission, diffusion, and the evaluative feedback loop. And I'm going to talk mostly about the evaluative feedback loop. And I'd like to talk about how it is affected in two specific communities that I have worked with in my research. And so my main question, again, is how changes in linguistic diversity within a linguistic ecosystem change the social pressures on what gets transmitted and or diffused. So let me start here with the Shinkin languages. It is true I am the last speaker of the Shinkin languages. It's a pretty heavy weight to carry, I guess. I love it. If you're interested, we can talk about Shinkin after this. I'm not going to talk a lot about it. I'm going to geek out and nerd about the languages just a little bit, but since this is a general audience, I won't go into it a lot, right? Shinkin is a small language family of at least 4 languages represented here on the left. There have been other languages that might have belonged to this family, but they were either undocumented or undescribed before the last speakers passed away. These languages were once spoken in southeastern Guatemala, and you can see the map here, in the departments of Santa Rosa, Jutiapa, and Jalapa. And they are unrelated to any other language ever have recorded or spoken in the world. So they are what we call a linguistic family isolate. These languages represent the only pre-colonial non-Mayan language group in Guatemala, and based on the number of macro diffusions, language borrowings, they have existed in an ecosystem characterized by language diversity, quantitatively and qualitatively for a very, very long time, especially before the European invasion. I was fortunate enough to work with the very last speakers and rememberers of the Shinkin languages. This is me working with Carlos Mendez, the last speaker of Huazacapan Xinca. And in this picture, at this time we were working on translating some traditional stories and learning about some of the grammatical properties of semantic alignment. During my time working with the Xinca community, I've observed changes in what is deemed authoritative and authentic Xincan use. And these are a direct consequence of the linguistic analyses of the languages. So in order to understand how the ecosystems have changed, I have to nerd out just really briefly about the languages themselves. I promise it won't be too intense. The Xincan linguistic system has a lot of features that are unique among the Mesoamerican languages, both phonologically and lexicomorphosyntactically. And this slide is just it's like I threw up just a bunch of highlights here. But I'll just walk through them really quick. The number of glottalized consonants in the Xincan languages is high. This is relatively unusual. It's definitely unusual for the Mesoamerican languages. There are a few in the Americas that have this, and elsewhere outside the Americas, but generally most languages don't have these ejectives and glottalized consonants. Those are the consonants with the little apostrophes after them. They also don't have any or they also have a very cool system of vowel harmony that is based on static sequential dependencies, so that within a word, vowels are must belong to a certain group. So the ones that are colored the same are the only ones that can belong within a single word. You can't cross the boundaries for those. There's also at the very top that template from activated topic to non-activated topic shows that word order and anaphoric marking are affected by pragmatic saliency in a way that is unique among the Mesoamerican languages. And this long list of words here shows that there are really only two grammatical categories lexically in the Xincan languages. Something that I've become accustomed to calling predicates and referents. And the labels nouns and verbs are really notions of use, and they're not really necessary for talking about lexical organization in the Xincan languages. So now, returning briefly to the authority and authenticity and changes of the Xincan ecosystem, the pre-colonial Xincan linguistic ecosystem might have been represented as in this diagram. And I've used the word elaha for the language they spoke, because that is the word language in the Xincan languages. The word Xinca didn't appear in any documented source until about 100 years after European colonization, and it's not a Xincan word, and we have no idea where it came from. So at this point, they would not have been called Xincas. They would have been called something else, but they would have been speaking elaha. And they would have existed in a typical linguistic ecosystem with a healthy intergenerational transmission process and a lot of influence, diffusion from other Mesoamerican languages like Mayan, Mihesokian, Hikake, and others. We know almost nothing about the evaluative feedback of the Xincan linguistic ecosystem at this time, but we can, in retrospect, suggest a couple things that were going on. First, distinct dialect groups of this language eventually split into very similar languages. This always represents a shift in authority and or authenticity. And second, there was a lot of fluidity in who claimed what identity pre-colonially, so that the Xincas often referred to themselves as Pipil, which is the name of a neighboring Uto-Aztecan language, and they seem to have meant something like peripherally situated non-Mayan cultural group, right? However, what is interesting here, what I find most interesting here, is that the Xincan speakers preserved their language systems for as long as we know, even despite the high amounts of quantitative linguistic diversity. The Xincan languages were still thriving until the arrival of the Spanish-speaking European colonizers. So when we talk about changes in linguistic ecosystems, it's not just a shift in the number of languages that transforms a linguistic ecosystem. In contrast, the colonization of Guatemala disrupted the Xincan linguistic ecosystem in such a way that eventually all speakers shifted to Spanish. And this happened for two reasons. First, the evaluative feedback loop was shifted to the authority of the Spanish users, the Spanish-speaking colonizers, as they were the most prestigious socially. And also note the change in from Ilaha to Xincan, because this is where that change happens, and they lose the recognition of the distinct varieties of the languages. So there was just considered one Xincan language at this time, even though there were more than one. And it wasn't until the 1990s or later that people started recognizing again that there were distinct languages. The second thing that happened was that the evaluative feedback shifted from the Spanish language users to the Spanish language itself, so that resources that were social and economic resources were only available to people who were using Spanish in this community, and still often only use Spanish. Then, during the Guatemalan Civil War, intergenerational transmission for the Xincas was completely disrupted, often consciously by the Xincan speakers. And this left the Xincan linguistic ecosystem something like a copy of the Spanish-speaking linguistic ecosystem. They were able to preserve the Xincan label as an inheritance from or memory of the past, but there was no longer anybody learning these languages actively. However, at the end of the Civil War and under Guatemala's current constitution, the Xincas are finally recognized as a distinct social, linguistic, and cultural group. They're seen as distinct from the Spanish-speaking population as well as the population of other Mesoamerican language users. However, since there is no more intergenerational transmission in the ecosystem, there was a gap. There was nothing or no one to present, to determine what was authoritative and authentic versions of Xincan language use. So the community has focused on the only thing they had left, and that was the documented resources containing information in, on, and about the Xincan languages. So this is where linguists get to put on their capes and say, wow, we did something great, we helped you. Right? So the current ecosystem is fairly interesting. So I'm sure there are other social factors that are present for defining the Xincan social identity, but it is clear that the linguistic materials, the consequences of the kinds of research that I do, are now the authoritative and authentic versions of these languages. And they're not always modern or appropriate. So as the Xincans use these languages, or they use these resources, their languages are significantly changed. So, for example, they've lost all glottalization when they try to relearn their languages. They no longer use the vowel harmony system, and the pragmatic saliency of for word order and the precategoriality are moot points that are just academic in nature. However, community members frequently mention these things by name and use evidence to talk about them outside of academic talks like this one, because they see this as a claim to authentic use from an established authority. So I should mention that Xincan use is still pretty restricted into very specific contexts and by very specific individuals as they're trying to reignite their linguistic ecosystem. But all of them rely on these language resources for both authenticity and authority. So the Xincan linguistic ecosystem has undergone drastic changes affecting the way the languages are used. But instead of just giving up, they have redefined their linguistic ecosystem and are in the process of adding this layer to the evaluative feedback loop that will hopefully restore the entire ecosystem back to full health. We can always ask the question, will it ever be exactly the same as before it was disrupted? The obvious answer, no. But if successful, the transformation will be a valuable and meaningful addition to the definition and preservation of linguistic diversity, both quantitatively and qualitatively in this community. Let me switch briefly to another language, authoritative. Authoritative is a linguistic isolate. It's a language not known to be related to any other language on the planet, and it's spoken by roughly 5,000 people or so in eastern Ecuador. And I've taken this map from Ethnologue to show the rough geographic distribution of its speakers. My collaboration with the Waorani, who speak authoritative, is still very much in its infancy. I spent 4.5 weeks this summer in Ecuador learning the language and conducting research on nasalization, information structure, and the sociolinguistic properties of their linguistic ecosystems. As a group, the Waorani were uncontacted until the late 1950s or early 1960s. That means that they were culturally isolated until about 70 years ago. During this time, their linguistic ecosystem would have been fairly stable, but only involved micro-diffusion. There are other groups who speak a variety of authoritative who have remained uncontacted to this day, but my authoritative teachers told me that the language these uncontacted groups use is intelligible, it's understood by the Waorani, but that it's quote-unquote very different, right? So this probably indicates some sort of sociolectical variation in the ecosystem. And this is what I see as the major source of microdiffusion in the ecosystem. However, after contact, sources of diffusion have been increased significantly. Currently, authoritative is used alongside other indigenous languages in Ecuador, such as Quechua and Shuar, among some others, in addition to Spanish. So they've added this layer of macro diffusion to their ecosystem. And the languages, all of these languages belong to a social hierarchy, with Spanish being the most prestigious at the top of the hierarchy and authoritative at the very bottom. My authoritative teachers, the Waurani, indicate that they feel prejudice from all sides, and they feel trapped in the labels of quote-unquote exotic or uncontacted. And while they value their language and culture, they feel pressure to interrupt their language intergenerational transmission process in order to provide better opportunities for their children. Another thing that they're doing is that they're trying to add English as a source of macro diffusion into their linguistic ecosystems. And they're, as of yet, they've done it without any direct diffusion from English. They've gotten a lot of loans from English, like Facebook and other things, through Spanish, but nothing directly from English. But the reason they're trying to add English into their ecosystems is because that many Wau live away from their traditional villages deeper in the jungle. They live in cities and towns more like what we would traditionally live in. And they do that to provide educational opportunities for their children and to have better employment opportunities. However, since parents only have a very basic education and unemployment is such a problem in Ecuador, they find it difficult to find ways to earn money to help pay for these things. So, for my main authoritative teacher, Maria, who is here in yellow, and that's her daughter, Adela, in blue. Maria is a skilled artisan and translator, but finds it difficult to find opportunities to work outside of the already saturated work environments where she lives. So the Waurani have hopes of turning to tourism as a way of leveraging their situations. They hope to bring tourists into their traditional Wau communities to show them who the Waurani really are and introduce them to some Wau ways of living. They recognize that speaking English is an important part of tourism, nationally and internationally, and so they're interested in having some of their young adults become fluent in English. It's unclear if there will be any direct diffusion from English as we go on, but it's definitely starting to become English is definitely starting to become part of this linguistic ecosystem. The second thing I want to note is that the Wau linguistic system is being rapidly changed due to a variety of social factors that have been created as a consequence of cultural contact. Now, to nerd out just a little bit about the languages, so you can understand what's going on here. The linguistic system is amazing. It's one of my favorite ones I've ever studied. It has more vowels than consonants, which is extremely unusual in the world's languages. It has no fricatives, no s or sh sounds or things like that. It has allophonic and phonemic nasalization, and like most languages with nasalization, it doesn't seem to have a single acoustic property that correlates with nasalization, which makes it really, really hard to learn as an L2 learner. It has a pretty nice number system here in the top right that you can learn in a matter of seconds, but it is being replaced for the Spanish number system because it's so long. So, for example, if I were to count to 5, it would be, to 4, to 6, it would be empoque go adoque, right? So you just add go, which is the plus, and you keep adding these numbers all together. It has relatively free word order, which appears to be pragmatically determined, like in the Shinkan languages. And one of my favorite features I found this summer was it has a bound pronominal temporal egophoricity split, where the first person of bound pronouns is treated differently in the past tense than all other persons and numbers. So, Authoritative has been written for approximately 50 years, and this written form has taken on the authority of quote-unquote correctness, causing the system itself to change. Also, there is a current split in what is deemed correct language use. There is an older system, and a newer system. And here's some examples of how how the language is splitting. And it took me a long time to figure out why my teacher would sometimes say geye for fish and sometimes ye or sometimes ye, right? And but I finally figured out, she finally helped me understand that that the language is changing significantly in newer generations compared to old, and this is because of the writing systems. I want to just talk about the very last line really quick. The endonym for this group is waurani, which is wow, the word for person, and dani, which is the third plus plural. Except that this D is pronounced as a tap, like the double D in English ladder, anytime it occurs word medially in the middle of a word. And so the name of this group is called the waurani. But because orthography writing is based on the Spanish tradition, it's written with in the ways that are in these two angled brackets here. You have both of those options available to you as in the orthography, and this is causing a lot of younger speakers to mischaracterize the R sound, so they're starting to pronounce it as waurani with an R rather than a tap. So the older speakers insist on writing it with a D and pronouncing it correctly, and the younger speakers write it with an R and say, I don't know why they're saying a D here, and there's a lot of confusion. And this is, again, about the orthography. Also, since writing is such a new prestigious social factor, it's changing the linguistic system in lots of interesting ways in terms of prescription and description. In this, what happens? So there's long vowels and nasalized vowels in this language, but they only really appear in careful, slow, elicited speech. And in fast naturalistic speech, the long vowels are only slightly longer than other vowels, and this is true for lots of languages with long and short vowels. And the representation of nasalization in the orthography in the writing systems is not consistent. So my wow Teredo teachers repeatedly told me, you write wow the way you speak. And at first I thought that meant it was phonemically transparent like Spanish is, or like orthographies generally are when they're young like this. But what I eventually learned is that they change their writing to match the register that they're speaking in. So in speed, for example, the word for to see will be written as it is in the very right, and care for can be written as the very right or with a double A, and both are correct, right? But I have heard my Wow Terero teachers correct their children a number of times because the children are using the fast speech orthographic representations as the most authoritative guide to accurate pronunciation in the language, and their parents are consistently saying, no, that you're losing something here. You're changing the system. And so this linguistic ecosystem is changing because of these social factors like literacy and other contact. Lastly, let me just conclude with some thoughts here. Frequently, we hear overly emotive discussions about language loss and shift, and a lot of actual and abstract hand-wringing to match it. However, my takeaway message that I'm hoping that you get today is not one of doom and gloom or of apocalyptic warnings. Rather, my conclusion is that as we understand what language diversity really is, both quantitatively and qualitatively, we can then talk about how changing the linguistic diversity in an ecosystem can affect what is perceived as authoritative and authentic language use. We need lots of healthy languages in ecosystems so that the processes of transmission and diffusion work appropriately, but we must recognize also that the social pressures on the linguistic systems are true and strong also. As linguists, we travel the world trying to help preserve the language systems around us, but we do it without interfering. But we definitely celebrate as communities transform their linguistic systems over time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Recognize that some of you may need to leave for 1 p.m. classes, but we invite you to stay and participate in our discussion. If you do have a question, Please raise your hand. We'll bring a microphone to you. We ask that you stand as you ask that. Tell us just a little bit about who you are. If you're a student, what you're studying. If you're faculty, what department you come from. And we will go until 1 p.m.
Hi, my name is Josh, and I'm a history major. And this may be a little bit of a oversimplification of things, but do you feel that in general that change in language is beneficial, or if you had the magic power to freeze everything as it is currently, would you choose to do that?
Good question. Yeah, I think languages have to change. The only reason languages stop changing is because every speaker is dead. Right? So we have to let languages change. And if this means that languages aren't monolithic, there's not something that we can call English that is true for all times and for all people, right? It means that they have to be able to adapt to each new social situation that they're found in. So thank you for that question.
My name is Earl, Chris's colleague in linguistics. When you said that the writing system has caused the language to change, it kind of caught me off guard. So I thought the writing down would cause it to stop changing a bit at least. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, I'm with you, Earl. It took me a long time. I was like, what the heck is going on here? So when they started writing down the language, the people who developed the writing system were using a variety of Wautereto that isn't the one that my language teachers use, and is not the variety of the big chunk of Wautereto users. And so, but they see that as the authoritative version of a language. And so they're transforming their pronunciations to match that orthography. Even though if you get them to not talk naturally, they don't ever do that. But they'll constantly correct me, for example. Like, no, you say it this way. And be like, but you didn't say it that way, right? Right. So, yeah. Thank you.
Hey, I'm Mike. I teach Guarani here. To what extent, and maybe you covered this earlier and I missed the first 10 minutes, but to what extent does the use of Spanish impact Wautereto speech and writing?
This is a fantastic question. So Spanish is part of the ecosystem now after contact with the Wautereto. Let me go back to that slide so you can see the way it looks. It's creating this macro diffusion here, and so there's a lot of things that are creeping in from Spanish into Wautereto, but only for the younger generation. So the younger generations will often go visit their grandparents in the jungle, and they'll be like, my grandpa speaks weird. I don't understand what he's saying, right? Because they are matching Spanish pronunciations, and they're doing it so quickly. It's almost as, if you know the history of English, it's almost as if they're going through the great vowel shift within the generation, right? It's that quickly because of the Spanish influence. So, yeah. I have to interrupt Lee. Lee is one of my graduate students, and so I'm really nervous that she's going to put me through the ringer. She just successfully defended her master's thesis, so now I think it's like her turn to turn on the heat here.
No, this one's easy. So you've been talking about how there are a lot of languages that are going through this evaluative feedback and having interference where, well, lots of languages where linguists want to assist the community in preserving the language. But so many of these languages have so few speakers, they're relatively unknown. So how does a linguist like you find languages that you want to work on?
How do I find languages I want to work on? My wife is also here, and she can tell you that I'm always thinking about languages, right? And that's how I find languages to work on. I sometimes in my office, and I just got through a lecture on campus that I think was either really good or really bad, but I find myself just staring at a computer screen, and I think, you know what I need to do? I need to go to the jungle. And so I just start looking on the language catalogs for languages that have resources available in them and those that don't, and I start reaching out to my colleagues everywhere and start determining which languages. Of course, choosing a language is to work on is it's a multifaceted thing. You have to determine like where you want to work. If you're not okay with bugs and scorpions, you're not going to want to go work with the Huautededo, right? And if you want to do air conditioning on a Mediterranean beach, you're probably going to restrict your interest a little bit. But there's lots of work to do there too. So you just have to determine where you feel most comfortable, what kinds of things you're most interested in, and how fast you can get to the jungle. So.
My name is Malcolm Boto. My wife and I teach Quiche Maya. And I have a question. The work that linguists do is so important at many levels. I'm also seeing in your presentation that there's a lot of power placed on those resources that are being used, right, as authoritative resources for language change. What's your perspective or your solution to questioning or looking at that positionality of who should have the authority and who should determine authenticity of language?
Yeah. Thank you, Malcolm. This is a really, also really great question. This is a hard question to answer, actually, because who determines authority and authenticity is often very hidden, right? And we don't know who is going to do it and when. So like in the Huautededo case, we didn't know that orthography was going to have such an authoritative presence in the community until 50 years later, and suddenly the children are all like, "What writing is the king here," right? But there is an acknowledgement as linguists go out and document and describe languages that we are potentially disrupting an ecosystem. And so we have to do so ethically and in a way that can help communities build the authority and authenticity in the ways they deem appropriate. Sometimes, like in the Shinken case, it is the resources that we create. Other times, they don't really care. They just want to be trained on how to do these things, and then the communities themselves will take it over. And I think that's probably the ideal situation, where we train community members to do this kind of work themselves and help them understand the factors in building and strengthening their own linguistic ecosystems.
Miriam Whiting, also from Department of Linguistics. So what I wanted to ask is, resources such as the internet, other virtual resources, how have they made your job easier and how have they made it harder? Or what kind of effect are they having with this work in general?
They've definitely changed the way we do language documentation and description, especially post-COVID, right? Because before COVID, there was a lot of people still going out into the jungle, but now everybody has access to Zoom or Facebook or whatever. And so just today, I received a messenger. I was talking with Maria on Messenger, right? So it's changing it in that in some ways it's shrinking the globe, right? We have access to a lot of people that used to be very hard to get to, right? In other ways, it's adding this layer into the ecosystems, these social factors especially, that we're not really sure how they're going to end up affecting languages. This is a new experience for the world, right? We've never had this amount of connectivity around the globe, and we're not exactly sure what's going to come of it. But it's definitely affecting it, right? So people everywhere want a phone and want Facebook and want WhatsApp and whatever it is, right? And they communicate. But one of the cool things we are seeing is that they're communicating in their languages. So today when I was talking to Maria, we were writing in Huautededo, and she corrected me, did this orthography thing, right? Where I said, this is the way you taught me this word, and she's like, but that's not the way I just said it, right? And so we had this argument about the way I'm supposed to write this one word, so yeah, it is changing it. In some ways it's fun, in some ways it's challenging, right? So, yeah.
My name is Ben, and in another life, I studied indigenous language poetry in Mexico, and I have a question. I think it was you when you were talking about Xincan language, how speakers of the language, they viewed Spanish as the more prestigious language, and I'm wondering about the cause of that. Was it a historical political process by the Guatemalan government where they kind of forced cultural assimilation and, changed the viewpoint of the people, or was it simply an economic factor where they had to speak Spanish in order to participate in the economy, and what the timing of that was.
Yeah, thank you. This happened fairly early on with European colonization. So what happened was the Catholic Church, who administered the colonies in the Americas, drew a literal line down the map of Guatemala. And on the western side, they said, we are pro-indigenous people, and we want people to learn the Catholic faith through indigenous languages. And Nahuatl was the primary language there. On the eastern side of this line, where the Xincan languages are spoken, this was big cattle country and indigo country. And so all the Spaniards wanted to live there because that was where the gold of the New World was, right? And so they were decimating indigenous cultures right and left so that they could thrive as Spanish-speaking colonizers. And so to thrive in this culture, you had to shift to Spanish for both economic and social reasons, right? So. And like I said, this happened pretty early on in the process. So.
My name is Abigail Crum. I am majoring in Spanish teaching. Okay, my name's Abigail Crum. I'm majoring in Spanish teaching. I know that for me, before I learned a second language was just something I never thought about until I was writing like a really important essay or something. And so I'm wondering how your understanding and you learning all these different languages has affected the way you view your native language, whatever that may be, if it's English.
Well, before I became a linguist, I thought English was awesome. And afterwards, I realized English is just another language, and it's not especially cool or uncool, it's just a language. But I have taken a unique perspective on all languages as I study them. They do become easier to learn and study. But what I find is that in each language there is something unique that we never thought would exist, and there it is, right? And in English, there happens to be a few of these. In some ways, it's a fairly exotic language, right? But in other ways, it's very boring, right? So, studying language like this and many languages like this has definitely affected my view of how I appreciate my own culture. My maternal grandmother was a native German speaker, which I did not inherit. She did not transmit to us. So that also affected the way I viewed my family relationships once I started learning languages. I realized that I had this job that I could restart language transmission within my own language family and start learning German, which I have not yet done, but my daughter has successfully done it, or is doing it. So yeah, thank you for the question.
Hi, I'm Ella. I'm studying Spanish teaching, and I was just wondering if there is an effect of the preservation of these smaller languages on the languages that are diffusing into them. For example, like
Fantastic.
Yeah, is there an effect of preserving Huautededo on Spanish?
That's a really good question. The way diffusion happens, I didn't talk a lot about the way diffusion happens, but substrate diffusion, this is where they go from these lower socially situated languages to the higher socially situated languages, there has to be, just particular features in the linguistic ecosystem for this to occur. And there is very few examples of, for example, of the Xincan becoming part of Spanish. There's a few Xincan Spanish words now in Guatemalan Spanish that are actually of Xincan origin, but like there's one or two, and they're very rare, and they're only used on the eastern side of the country, and only by, in certain contexts, right? In the Huautededo system, there isn't as of yet any influence of Huautededo on Spanish. And I doubt there will be, because Spanish has this huge place, right? It is like we are king of the mountain here in Ecuador. And the indigenous communities are trying to fight up that mountain and say, we also have a place here. And so I'm not sure if there will be or what it is, but maybe. So, one more question?
On? Okay, yeah. Hi, I'm Morgan. I study human development. So I don't really understand too much about language, but I am curious with globalization, as you talked about, your opinions on positive or negative benefits of having a predominant language such as English needed to be pilots or that type of thing. Yeah. Is that a positive effect on transforming culture, or does that take away from?
Thank you for this question, and it's not too late. You can learn all you want about language. Just come take my classes. I'm happy to teach you. I think that it's too simplistic to say is it positive or negative to say if globalization has an effect on the languages. It is, right? And we can't argue for or against it. It is, right? But what we can say is something like, what does this do? Well, something like pilots all speaking English does have the advantage of fewer people dying in air crashes, right? And so there is an advantage, right? But if we were to say, therefore, everybody needs to speak the same language across the planet for all contexts and all situations, we lose something in our linguistic ecosystem that is necessary for cultural sustainability, right? So is there pros and cons? Definitely, but I think it's for each community to determine how that should work or not work and how they want to plug into the global network of English or not plug into it. Okay. And thank you so much for your questions.
Thank you.